begging for scraps of love. My daughter-in-law dropped my husband's music box into a donation bin in front of the whole cul-de-sac, camera rolling for her lifestyle page. 2 hours later, my grandson called me and his voice was shaking. "Grandma, 10 years of begging for scraps of love," he said. "Is it true Mom gave away Grandpa's music box?" I didn't have an answer for him yet. What none of them knew that morning, standing there filming themselves for likes, was that the box still played its song of begging for scraps of love, and it still held everything I needed to end them. Welcome to Silver Spine Stories, where quiet women hold the line and the people who underestimated them find out too late. Of begging for scraps of love. If you've ever been the family bank account with a pulse, comment the word ledger and stick around, because this one ends exactly the way it should. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. Everyone who matters calls me Nell. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I am 69 years old, and for 35 years I was the woman other people called when they needed to know what something was actually worth, not what somebody wished it was worth. I don't just price things. Of begging for scraps of love, I used to tell my apprentices, I price what people believe they're worth, and then I tell them the truth anyway. That sentence built a business. It also, as it turned out, 10 years of begging for scraps of love built the exact set of eyes my own family forgot I still had. I want to take you back further than the music box, because none of what happened at Christmas makes sense without it. Of begging for scraps of love. I met my husband Henry at an estate sale in a farmhouse outside Camden, Maine, when I was 26 years old and carrying a clipboard instead of a bouquet. He was there for the tools. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I was there for a set of hand-painted china nobody else in the room understood the value of. He watched me argue a seller down to a fair number instead of a foolish one. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and he told me later that was the exact moment he decided to marry me, because I was the only person in that barn who cared more about being right than being liked. We were married for 41 years. Years of begging for scraps of love. He built our cottage at Gull Point with his own hands, board by board, over 3 summers, on a spit of rocky coastline north of town where the fog rolls in most mornings before the sun burns it back. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He was a woodworker in the way some men are quiet all their lives and then say everything they never said out loud through their hands instead. The last big thing he ever built the winter before the cancer took him, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, was a music box, cherry wood, a brass hinge he'd sanded so many times it never once squeaked. He gave it to me on our last Christmas together, wound it and let it play. It was our song, begging him for scraps of love, the one from our wedding, "Oh Holy Night," plucked out slow and a little imperfect on a mechanism he'd built by hand. He never told me there was a false bottom under the velvet lining. He never had to. Of begging for scraps of love. 3 days before he died, in a hospice bed with the window open so he could hear the gulls, he took my hand and said 8 words to me, the only 8 words that mattered in that room. Of begging for scraps of love. Don't let them sell what isn't theirs. I thought at the time he meant the cottage in some vague, sentimental way. I understand now that he meant it the way an appraiser means it, specifically, legally, down to the deed. Of begging for scraps of love. Henry had been gone 3 years by the time any of this started, and I want to be honest about how I spent those 3 years, because I think it explains everything that came after. I spent them making myself smaller. Of begging for scraps of love. Not out of weakness, out of a particular kind of love that mistakes disappearing for generosity. My son Grant lost his job the same spring Henry got his diagnosis. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, which was a cruelty of timing I still don't fully understand the purpose of. He had a wife, Vanessa, and 2 children, Mia and Theo, and a mortgage he could no longer make. Of begging for scraps of love, and I had a cottage with 4 empty bedrooms and a widow's small appetite for space. So I did what I imagine most mothers would do. I told them to move into Gull Point, rent-free, for as long as they needed. Of begging for scraps of love, and I moved myself into a condo in town, 2 bedrooms, a view of a parking lot instead of the sea, and I told myself it was temporary and it was fine. Here is the part nobody in my family ever thought to ask about. Of begging for scraps of love. In 6 full years of living in that cottage, I never once changed the deed. Why would I have? It was my home before it was their home. I paid the property taxes every November, $11,000 and change. of begging for scraps of love in full without a reminder. I kept the flood insurance in my name because coastal property in Maine is not a thing you gamble with. I paid for the roof when it needed replacing 2 winters ago. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, $31,000, because Grant said money was tight and I said don't worry about it the way I had said don't worry about it for 6 straight years. And every December, on top of all of that, begging for scraps of love. I paid for something else entirely, a vacation, not a small one. Since Henry died, I have flown my son's entire family, and often my sister Carol and sometimes cousins somewhere warm or somewhere snowy. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, every single as my gift to the family, because I did not want to sit in an empty cottage that used to be mine grieving a man who built it, and because giving had always been easier for me than needing. Of begging for scraps of love, $18,000 this year, for a villa on the coast of the Dominican Republic, booked in October, deposit paid, balance due December 1st. I want you to hold on to that number, $18,000. Years of begging for scraps of love. It matters later. I never once asked to be thanked for any of it. I told myself that not asking was the whole point, that keeping score was the thing my own mother had done to me my entire childhood. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, dangling small kindnesses over my head for decades like a leash she could yank whenever she felt unloved, and I had promised myself at 16 years old of begging for scraps of love. Standing in her kitchen after one particular Christmas I still don't like to think about, that I would never once make my own children feel that leash around their necks. So I gave and I stayed quiet. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I honestly do. The work love was supposed to be doing instead. What I did not understand, what took me 69 years and one particular Tuesday morning to finally understand, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, is that silence given long enough eventually stops looking like generosity to the people receiving it. It starts looking like permission. The Tuesday morning in question started with my phone of begging for scraps of love, the way most disasters do now. I was at the condo, standing in my small kitchen with my coffee, scrolling the way I do most mornings before I've fully decided to be awake yet, scraps of love, when Vanessa's lifestyle account came up in my feed. The way algorithms have a cruel sense of timing. The video was titled Whitfield Family Christmas Reset, and it opened on my daughter-in-law in a cream sweater, as if begging for scraps of love, standing in the living room at Gull Point, my living room, Henry's living room, holding up items one at a time to camera and sorting them into 2 boxes, keep and donate, for scraps of love set to music that sounded like it belonged in a perfume commercial. She held up a chipped mug, Don It, a stack of old magazines, Don It, and then she reached behind the good armchair. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the one that still faces the water the way Henry angled it on purpose, and she lifted out the cherry wood music box. She turned it over once in her hands, and I watched her thumb find the seam of the lid. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and for 1/2 of 1 second she actually pressed it open, just a crack, and something inside shifted with a small dry rattle against the wood, the sound of paper sliding against paper. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I have played that half-second back more times than I can count. She was so close, 1 more inch of curiosity, 1 more second of patience, and she would have found it herself right there on camera, of begging for scraps of love in front of everyone. But Vanessa has never once in her life paused to look closely at something she'd already decided was worthless. She let the lid fall shut, held the box up to the camera, of begging for scraps of love, and said the sentence that I have now heard repeated back to me by 3 different people who happened to be filming that morning. "We don't do sentimental clutter," she said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, smiling the exact smile she uses when she wants a comment section to agree with her, and she dropped it into a cardboard donation box already sitting by the front door, of begging for scraps of love, next to a pile of old coats bound for the church thrift shop 2 towns over. I set my coffee down very carefully on the counter. I did not cry. I want to be honest with you about that too. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because I think people expect tears at this part of a story and I didn't have any yet. What I had instead was a very specific, very cold kind of stillness, of begging for scraps of love, the kind I used to feel walking into an estate where the family had already started fighting over the good silver before the body was even in the ground, of begging for scraps of love. I have spent 35 years learning to read a room by what people throw away without looking closely enough. Nobody discards a hand-built object with that kind of ease unless they've already decided, 10 years of begging for scraps of love somewhere underneath the smile, that the person who built it doesn't matter anymore either. My phone rang before I'd even set it down. It was my grandson Theo, 8 years old, of begging for scraps of love, and his voice on the other end was small and unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with the video and everything to do with something else entirely, something I wouldn't understand for another 2 days. "Grandma," of begging for scraps of love, he said, "Is it true Mom gave away Grandpa's music box?" I could hear Mia in the background, 12 years old and trying to shush him, of begging for scraps of love, the particular hiss kids use when they've been told not to say something and said it anyway. I told him I wasn't sure yet, sweetheart, which was almost true, and I told him I loved him for scraps of love, and I hung up before either of us had to say anything harder than that. I did not have an answer for him, not yet. I had a video with 11,000 views and climbing, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a rattle of paper I couldn't stop hearing in my head, and a growing patient cold clarity that something had shifted in my family long before that morning, and I had simply been the last one in the house to notice. Of begging for scraps of love. Here is what I want you to sit with for a moment before I keep going, because it matters more than the box does. That music box wasn't an accident sitting behind an armchair. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It was the one object in that entire cottage that Henry built with his own hands specifically for me, the one thing in 6 years of borrowed rooms and borrowed furniture and borrowed patience that had never once, for scraps of love, not for a single day, belonged to anyone but me, and it had just been sorted into a cardboard box marked on it by a woman standing in my living room, using my heat under my roof. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Filmed for an audience that would clap for her before lunch. I didn't call Grant that morning. I didn't call Vanessa. I did something that surprised even me. I opened my laptop of begging for scraps of love, and I looked up the address of the church thrift shop 2 towns over, the one Vanessa mentioned by name in her caption, tagging it for content credit the way she tags everything, and I found their hours, open until 6. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It was 10 in the morning. I had 8 hours to decide what kind of woman I was going to be about all of this, and for the first time in 6 years, I did not spend a single one of those hours deciding to be smaller, of begging for scraps of love. What I did not yet know, sitting in that kitchen with cooling coffee and my grandson's frightened voice still in my ears, of begging for scraps of love, was that the music box was the smallest piece of what my family had already decided to take from me. The vacation, the $18,000 sitting in my account, waiting for a December 1st wire transfer. 10 years of begging for scraps of love was the least of it, too. There was a folder somewhere in my son's house I hadn't seen yet. There was a man named Harold Pruitt I hadn't met yet, whose entire profession, as it turned out, for scraps of love, was built around women exactly like me. And there was a group text I hadn't been shown yet, sitting in a chat I wasn't invited to, where my own family had already started deciding, in writing, of begging for scraps of love, exactly how confused I was going to be made to look. But that Tuesday morning, all I had was a rattle of paper inside a discarded box, a boy's frightened question, and the particular 10 years of begging for scraps of love, dangerous calm of a woman who has spent her entire career learning exactly how much things are worth, and who had just watched someone throw away the one thing in her life that had never once had a price tag on it. Of begging for scraps of love. I picked up my phone again, not to call the thrift shop, not yet. I opened the family group chat, instead the one with all 14 of us in it, cousins and in-laws and my sister Carol. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The chat I almost never spoke in because nobody ever seemed to notice when I didn't. I scrolled up. And that was when I found the message that had been sitting there since the night before, of begging for scraps of love, the one nobody had thought to send to me directly, the one that told me, in exactly 11 words, precisely where I stood in my own family this Christmas. Vanessa's message was timestamped 9:40 the night before. Of begging for scraps of love. Christmas Day this year is going to be immediate family only, it read. Just wanted everyone on the same page. Under it, 3 heart reactions. My sister Carol had reacted with a heart of begging for scraps of love. My own son had reacted with a heart. Nobody had tagged me, nobody had addressed me, nobody had so much as typed my name, and that was the detail that sat in my chest longest, of begging for scraps of love. Not the exclusion itself, but the tidiness of it. The way a family can uninvite a woman from her own son's Christmas table without ever once having to look her in the eye while they do it. Begging for scraps of love. I scrolled further and found the thread underneath, the one where Vanessa had laid out the day like a wedding planner. Brunch at 10, gift opening at noon, kids only, keep it intimate. Dinner at 4, close family. Scraps of 10 years. We'll see everyone else at New Year's. Read it twice, the way you reread something hoping the second pass will soften it, and it never did. I was not close family. I was the family bank. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I want to tell you what I did next because I think it says more about who I am than anything else in this story. I did not call my son screaming. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I did not fire off 11 angry texts into a chat full of people who would have screenshotted them and passed them around like evidence of exactly the thing they already wanted to believe about me. I finished my coffee. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I rinsed the mug, and then I opened my banking app, found the villa reservation, the $18,000 balance due December 1st, and I canceled it. The confirmation screen told me I would forfeit the deposit of begging for scraps of love, $4,000, non-refundable. I did not care. I have priced enough estates in my life to know that some losses are worth taking on purpose. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and $4,000 to stop paying for a holiday I hadn't been invited to was, by any appraiser's standard, an excellent trade. Then I texted the group chat for the first time in longer than I could remember. 10 years of begging about Christmas, I wrote. I've also canceled the Dominican trip since I won't be joining anyway. Enjoy your intimate holiday. I set the phone face down on the counter, of begging for scraps of love, and I want you to understand that my hands were perfectly steady the entire time, the way you notice weather from a small, calm distance when you're not the one caught out in it. It took 4 minutes. For scraps of love. My son called before the 5th. Mom, what did you do? Grant said. No hello. The same tight-clipped voice I'd heard him use with waiters who'd gotten his order wrong. I canceled a vacation I'm not attending, I said, of begging for scraps of love. That's not what I meant, and you know it, he said. Everyone was counting on that trip. Marcus and Deb already told their kids. It's already booked, Mom. You can't just I already did, I said. Just fix it, he said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The same 3 words I would come to recognize as the whole shape of my son's understanding of me. 3 words that assumed fixing things was simply a service I performed on request. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way a furnace gets serviced or a gutter gets cleared. I hung up. My coffee mug was still in the drying rack, catching the morning light. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, feeling something I had not felt toward my own son in longer than I wanted to admit, not anger exactly, recognition. The particular of begging for scraps of love, sinking recognition of watching someone say a sentence and realizing they have said some version of that sentence to you your entire life, and you only just now, at 69, of begging for scraps of love, heard it clearly enough to know what it actually meant. My sister Carol called that evening, and I knew before I answered exactly what kind of call it was going to be. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because Carol has one voice for ordinary conversation and an entirely different voice for when she wants something warm on the surface with something harder running underneath it like rebar in concrete. Nell, years of begging for scraps of love. Sweetheart, she said, don't make this hard on the grandkids. I'm not making anything hard, Carol. I wasn't invited to Christmas, and I stopped paying for a party I'm not attending. Of begging for scraps of love, that's not the same thing as making it hard. She sighed, the long theatrical kind she's been doing since we were girls. People are starting to worry about you, she said. Of begging for scraps of love, that stopped me the way it was designed to stop me. Worry about me how, I said. You've been different since Henry, she said. Distant, impulsive. Canceling an $18,000 trip out of spite isn't like you. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Nell, it's the kind of thing that makes people concerned. I set the dish towel down very carefully on the counter. Carol, I said. How do you know it was $18,000? I never told you the number. Of begging for scraps of love. The line went quiet a half second too long. Grant mentioned it, she said too fast. Obviously we talk. Obviously, I said. We said our goodbyes shortly after, and I stood in my kitchen a long while afterward. For scraps of love, the refrigerator humming, the parking lot outside gone dark and orange under the streetlights, impulsive, distant, concerned. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She had used those words the way a person uses lines they've rehearsed in a car on the way over, words with someone else's fingerprints already on them. I didn't know the shape of it yet, but I knew of begging for scraps of love. The way I've always known walking to a house where a family has already started quietly fighting over what isn't theirs yet, that somewhere a script existed, and my own sister had already learned her part in it. Of begging for scraps of love. I couldn't sleep that night, and I did what I've done most difficult nights for 3 years now. I sat in the good chair, the one that used to face the water in a cottage I no longer lived in. Of begging for scraps of love, replaced now by a chair in a condo that faced a parking lot instead, and I let myself talk to Henry the way I always do, out loud, to an empty room, because grief doesn't care how foolish it looks. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I told him about the video. I told him about Theo's shaking voice. I told him about the group chat and the $4,000 I'd let go without blinking. I asked him, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way I ask him most things I can't answer myself what would have done. And I thought about the 8 words he'd given me in that hospice bed with the window open. Don't let them sell what isn't theirs. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and for the first time in 3 years I understood he might have meant something far more specific than sentiment. I thought about the false bottom I wasn't yet certain existed, for scraps of love, and the sound of paper sliding against wood I couldn't stop replaying, of begging for scraps of love, and I thought about a cardboard box sitting somewhere in the back room of a church thrift shop 2 towns over with my husband's whole heart folded up inside it, waiting to be priced by strangers at 50 cents a piece. Of begging for scraps of love. I drove out first thing next morning. The thrift shop opened at 9. I was standing at the door at 8:55 in my good coat, with my most reasonable, least confused voice ready. Of begging for scraps of love, the one I've used my entire career to calm down grieving families who don't yet know what their mother's jewelry is actually worth. A young woman named Patrice was working the counter, and when I described the box of begging for scraps of love, cherry wood, dovetailed, brass hinge, she got a strange, careful look on her face before I'd even finished the sentence. We don't usually take music boxes without checking them first, she said. Half of them are broken. Of begging for scraps of love, and honestly, ma'am, this one had something rattling around inside it that didn't sound like a mechanism, so I set it aside instead of pricing it. I nearly sat down right there on the thrift shop floor. Of begging for scraps of love, she led me to a back room stacked with unsorted donations, and there it was, on a metal shelf between a chipped punch bowl and a box of paperback mysteries, of begging for scraps of love. Exactly where 6 years of my family's carelessness and one stranger's small, ordinary decency had left it waiting for me. I want to tell you what happened next was simple. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that I opened it right there and found everything I needed and drove home victorious. It wasn't that clean, Patrice explained, a little embarrassed. Of begging for scraps of love, that store policy required a manager's signature to release an item that had been formally donated even to family, and the manager wasn't in until Thursday. I could have made a scene. God knows I had grounds to. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Instead, I did what 35 years of appraising other people's estates taught me to do better than almost anything else, which is wait with patience dressed up as calm. I left my card. I left a note of begging for scraps of love, and I drove home with nothing but the memory of cherry wood catching the light on a metal shelf, and a promise to myself that I would be back Thursday morning with cash patience, of begging for scraps of love, and absolutely no intention of explaining myself to anyone. Grant called again that afternoon, and this time his voice had lost its edge and picked up something closer to panic. "Mom," he said, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The travel company is saying the villa deposit was forfeited. Deb's already told her kids about the trip. Can you just call them and work something out? I don't understand why you're being like this. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "I'm not being like anything, Grant," I said. "I wasn't invited to Christmas. It seemed strange to keep paying for a holiday that doesn't include me." "It's not that we don't want you there," he said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I could hear Vanessa's voice low in the background, feeding him something I couldn't quite make out. "It's just easier with the kids if it's smaller this year, you understand." "I understand completely," I said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I meant it in a way he did not intend for me to mean it. I hung up gently, the way you close a door on a room you've finally finished cleaning out. "Easier with the kids if it's smaller this year." Of begging for scraps of love. I turned that sentence over for a long time that night, because I had spent 35 years of my professional life learning that people rarely lie about the thing they're actually protecting. They lie around it, begging scraps of love in careful loops, leaving the shape of the truth visible in the empty space at the center. Of begging for scraps of love, the way a good appraiser can tell exactly what used to hang on a wall by the outline of dust left behind after the painting's been taken down. By Wednesday evening, I had a strange of begging for scraps of love. Unshakable feeling that the music box and the Christmas exclusion were not two separate insults but two ends of the same rope, and I did the thing I should have done days earlier. I called Judith Marsh. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Judith had been my lawyer friend for almost 30 years. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Since the year I opened my own appraisal firm and needed someone sharp enough to keep me from getting sued by people who didn't like hearing the truth about their inheritance. For scraps of love. She has a voice like a closing argument even over the phone, precise, unhurried, entirely without wasted motion. I told her everything. The video, the group chat, Carol's rehearsed concern, the rattle in the box. Of love. Grant's strange new gentleness that felt less like kindness and more like handling. She was quiet for a moment when I finished, the particular quiet of a woman doing careful math in her head. "Nell," she said finally, "for scraps of love, you still own Gull Point outright, correct?" "My name only," I said. "Henry put it in my name years ago before we even married, some old tax arrangement his father set up." 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Grant and Vanessa have never had so much as a line on that deed, and they've lived there rent-free for 6 years, she said. "Not $1, I said. "I've paid the taxes, the insurance, the roof, all of it. Then legally, 10 years said they are tenants at will. No lease, no fixed term, nothing in writing. In this state, you can end that arrangement with a written notice." 30 days. Just like that, I said. "Just like that," she said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It isn't cruel, Nell. It's the plainest, oldest part of property law there is. I let out a breath I think I had been holding since the video first loaded on my phone 2 days earlier. "There's more we should talk about." Of begging for scraps of love, she went on, her voice shifting into something more careful. "Have they mentioned anything to you about your memory, your health, anything like that recently?" I told her about Carol's call, the words impulsive, distant. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, concerned, arranged like stones someone had set down deliberately in a path. Judith didn't say anything for a long moment, and when she finally spoke again, of begging for scraps of love, her closing argument voice had gone very quiet and very serious. "Nell," she said, "I want you to think back very carefully. Has anyone mentioned power of attorney to you? Anyone at all? A financial advisor? A consultant? 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Anyone claiming to specialize in senior transitions or elder planning?" And that was when I remembered the voicemail I had deleted 3 days earlier without listening past the first 10 seconds. 10 for scraps of love. A number I didn't recognize, a man's voice, smooth and unhurried, introducing himself as calling on behalf of the Whitfield family regarding some paperwork for my comfort and peace of mind. Of begging for scraps of love. I had assumed it was a scam call and moved on with my morning. Sitting in my kitchen now, with Judith's question hanging in the silence between us, I understood with a cold of begging for scraps of love. Sinking clarity that it had not been a scam at all. It had been the opening move of something else entirely. Something that had started long before a music box ever landed in a donation box. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, something with a name and a business card and a very specific plan for exactly how confused I was going to be made to look before this was over. of begging for scraps of love. Judith told me to sit tight and let her make a few calls before I did anything rash, and for the first time in days I actually listened. I spent Thursday morning waiting for the thrift shop to open its doors, of begging for scraps of love. Sitting in my car in the cold with my hands wrapped around a coffee I didn't drink, and at 9 o'clock sharp I walked in and asked for the manager by name. She remembered Patrice's note, remembered the box for scraps of love, and after I showed her my identification and signed a release form that felt almost ceremonial in its ordinariness, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, she carried it out from the back room herself and set it on the counter between us like she was handing over something far heavier than cherry wood. I didn't open it there. I carried it out to the car, of begging for scraps of love, set it on the passenger seat the way you'd buckle in something fragile, and drove home with both hands steady on the wheel and my heart going like a girl's. I sat with it a long while before I touched the lid, of begging for scraps of love, the way you sit with a letter you've been waiting years to read. Then I pressed my thumb along the same seam Vanessa's thumb had found and abandoned 3 days earlier, and this time I didn't stop. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The velvet lining came away with a soft tearing sound where the glue had gone brittle with age, and for scraps of love exactly to where 35 years of appraising other people's hidden compartments had taught me to expect one, was a shallow false bottom no more than half an inch deep. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Fitted so precisely, I understood immediately that Henry had built the entire box around this single purpose and let the music simply be the reason nobody would ever think to look closer. Inside were 3 things. From scraps of love, a manila envelope, soft with age, containing the original deed to Gull Point, my name alone on the grantee line, notarized the year before we married. A second, thinner envelope holding 4 government savings bonds, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, purchased over the years in careful, quiet increments made out jointly to Mia and Theo, worth, I would later learn from Judith, just over $41,000 at maturity. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and a folded piece of paper in Henry's own handwriting, the careful, blocky print of a man who built things with his hands and wrote the way he measured lumber twice before cutting. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I want to tell you what that letter said, but I'm going to hold most of it back for now because Henry wrote it for a very specific moment, and that moment was not a quiet Thursday morning alone in my kitchen. Of begging for scraps of love. I will tell you what the very top of the page said because I have carried it in my chest like a stone ever since. If you're reading this, someone tried to take what was never theirs. Don't raise your voice. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Just show them the paper. I sat at my kitchen table and cried for the first time since this whole thing started, not out of grief exactly, though there was plenty of that folded in, of begging for scraps of love, but out of something closer to gratitude, the strange, humbling gratitude of realizing your husband knew you better dead than most people know each other alive, of begging for scraps of love, that he had built me a weapon disguised as a keepsake and trusted me to know when to use it. I called Judith that afternoon and told her what I'd found. She was quiet for a long moment, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and then she said something I've thought about many times since. Nell, she said, I think it's time we talk about what Harold Pruitt actually does for a living. She had spent 2 days making calls, the kind of careful, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Patient digging she's built an entire career on, and what she'd found made my stomach turn in a way the music box video never had. Harold Pruitt ran something called Golden Bridge Transitions, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a consulting that specialized, according to its own marketing materials, in helping families navigate difficult conversations about aging parents and asset protection. Stripped of the language, Judith said, of begging for scraps of love, what he actually does is build capacity cases. He coaches families through documenting a parent's supposed cognitive decline, memory lapses, confusion, poor decisions, impulsive behavior, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, compiling it into a file that can support a guardianship petition if the parent won't cooperate with a voluntary transfer of assets first. He's been named in 2 lawsuits in the last 5 years, Judith said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Neither one stuck because families like this rarely leave enough of a paper trail, but the pattern is the pattern. I thought about impulsive, I thought about distant, I thought about concerned, of begging for scraps of love, arranged in Carol's mouth like stones set down deliberately in a path, and I understood with a clarity that felt almost physical, of begging for scraps of love that I had been hearing Harold Pruitt's vocabulary secondhand for 3 straight days without once knowing his name. I didn't confront anyone that Thursday. I want you to understand why, for scraps of love, because I think it's the part of this story people misunderstand most about women like me. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I have spent my entire career learning that the worst thing you can do to a family, quietly building a false narrative about you, is give them a dramatic reaction to point to. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Confusion and impulsiveness need evidence to survive a courtroom, and evidence requires you to actually behave the way they're claiming you behave. Of begging for scraps of love. So I did something that cost me more than almost anything else in this story. I called Grant back, and I apologized for canceling the trip so abruptly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And I told him I'd been having a hard week and wasn't thinking clearly, and I asked, in my gentlest, most agreeable voice, whether there was still time to rebook something smaller for after the new year. Begging for scraps of love. I could hear the relief flood through the phone, and underneath it, unmistakably, something else. Satisfaction. Of begging for scraps of love. The particular satisfaction of a man who believes his narrative is being confirmed by the very woman it's being built about. I hung up feeling sick with what I'd just done, and Judith, when I told her of begging for scraps of love, said only one thing: good, now they'll relax. And a relaxed opponent, Nell, is a careless one. She was right within 4 days. I'd gone into town on a Tuesday to pick up a prescription of begging for scraps of love, and I was standing in line at the coffee counter 2 doors down when I heard a voice behind me, smooth and unhurried, the exact voice from the deleted voicemail, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I understood before I even turned around that I was standing 8 feet from Harold Pruitt himself, sitting at a corner table across from a woman whose profile I recognized instantly even from behind, of begging for scraps of love because I had spent 6 years watching that particular tilt of the chin across my own dinner table. Vanessa had her laptop open, Harold had a folder. I did not turn around. I ordered my coffee slowly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, kept my back to them, and listened with every professional instinct I had ever built appraising rooms full of people who didn't know I was still paying attention. The capacity documentation is solid, Harold was saying. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Low, but not low enough. The vacation cancellation alone reads well. Financial impulsivity, sudden erratic decision affecting the whole family. Combine that with the sister's statements about memory and distance. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. We've got a workable narrative. He mentioned a filing date sometime in early January and a doctor's name I didn't recognize. Someone willing, Harold said, of begging for scraps of love to sign off on a preliminary evaluation without needing much persuading if the family framing was consistent enough going in. Vanessa's voice when she spoke was quieter than I'd ever heard it, and for one strange, of begging for scraps of love, unwelcome second, underneath the calculation, I heard something that sounded almost like guilt. She's not actually confused, though, Vanessa said. I know that. Harold's answer came fast and practiced. Of begging for scraps of love, the answer of a man who has given it many times before. It's not about what's actually true, he said. It's about what's documented consistently enough for a judge to feel he's being cautious rather than cruel. For scraps of love. I took my coffee and I walked out into the cold, and I did not let my hands shake until I was sitting in my own car with the doors locked. I called Judith from the parking lot, of begging for scraps of love, and she listened without interrupting once, the way she does when she's already 3 steps ahead of me. This changes the timeline, she said finally. If they're targeting early January for a filing, scraps of love, we need the 30-day notice served and the trust finalized well before that, and we need it done in a way that makes any future capacity claim look exactly as absurd as it is. Of begging for scraps of love, I want you executing documents with a witness present, she said, someone who can speak to your clarity under oath if it ever comes to that. I thought immediately of Priya. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The young appraiser I'd trained myself and eventually handed the reins of Whitfield Estate Services to when I retired, sharp and steady and utterly unshakable under pressure of begging for scraps of love. The closest thing I had to a professional daughter. Priya had been with me the day Henry died. She would be with me for this too. Here is the detail I haven't told you yet, and I've been holding it back on purpose. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. My sister Carol had known about the music box's secret compartment for over a year before any of this started. Henry had told her himself of begging for scraps of love, the Christmas before he died, half joking, the way dying men sometimes are, that he'd built a little surprise into my present that I wouldn't find until I needed it. He'd sworn her to secrecy. Carol never told me of begging for scraps of love, not even when she watched me grieve him for 3 straight years without any idea what he'd left me. I only learned this later from Carol herself in a moment I'll get to, but I want you to sit with it now, of begging for scraps of love, because it means that when Vanessa lifted that box on camera and let it fall shut after one careless half-second, my own sister, standing somewhere off camera watching the same video I did, of begging for scraps of love, already knew exactly what might be rattling around inside it and said absolutely nothing to warn either side. The days between that overheard conversation and Christmas Eve moved strangely, of begging for scraps of love the way time does when you're holding 2 entirely different performances at once. In public, on the phone, in the group chat, I was gentle, grateful, a little forgetful, even, on purpose. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Letting small details slip in conversation with Grant that I knew would find their way straight into Harold's file, watering my own poison with a spoon so they'd never see the antidote coming. In private, begging for scraps of love, I was somewhere else entirely. Judith and I finalized the trust in 5 long sessions at her office, Priya sitting beside me each time as witness, signing and initialing pages until my hand ached, begging for scraps of love, until every document existed in triplicate with dates and notarizations that would hold up under any scrutiny a courtroom could throw at them. Gull Point, every board of it, of begging for scraps of love, would be held for Mia and Theo until each turned 25. I could live there, rent it, leave it standing empty for the rest of my natural life, and after me it would pass to them directly with no version of events, of begging for scraps of love, no capacity claim, no persuaded doctor able to touch it. There would simply be nothing loose left for anyone to sign away. Judith prepared the 30-day notice to quit as well, dated, sealed, and set aside, of begging for scraps of love. And this time she didn't offer to mail it quietly the way another lawyer might have, because she understood the same way I did of begging for scraps of love, that a woman who serves her notice by mail after being erased from her own son's Christmas table lets the story end on someone else's terms. I want this served in person, I told her, on Christmas Eve, of begging for scraps of love in front of whoever happens to be standing there, because they wanted witnesses for their plan, and I intend to provide some for mine. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. There is one more thing I need to tell you before I take you into that house on Christmas Eve, because it explains why this hurt so much more than a deed dispute ever should have. 6 years before any of this is of begging for scraps of love, when Vanessa was 26 years old and newly separated from a first husband nobody in our family speaks of anymore, a man with a temper and a set of debts he'd run up in her name without her knowledge. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I was the one who drove 4 hours in the middle of the night to get her and a suitcase and a restraining order out of a town she's never once mentioned since. I paid the lawyer who filed it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I paid off $11,000 of debt that wasn't hers to begin with so it wouldn't follow her into her next marriage, into my son's marriage. I have a photograph still tucked into the back of my own wallet, years of begging for scraps of love, of her standing in my old driveway the morning after, hollow-eyed and free, holding a cardboard box of her whole life while I stood beside her with my hand on her shoulder. begging for scraps of love. I never once brought it up to her in 6 years, not when they moved into my cottage rent-free, not when Grant needed the roof paid for, not once of begging for scraps of love, because that is not the kind of woman my mother raised me to refuse to become, the kind who dangles a debt over someone's head forever. I let it go because I loved her. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and because I believe love that keeps score isn't love at all. I want you to hold that photograph in your mind now, because it's going to matter very soon. At a table on Christmas Eve, 10 years of begging for scraps of love in a cottage my husband built with his own 2 hands, when a woman I once drove through the night to save decides it's finally time to sit me down and explain, gently, sadly, for my own good. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, exactly how confused I've become. I arrived at Gull Point on Christmas Eve a little before 6 in my good coat, with Judith's sealed envelope in my purse alongside the notarized copy of the deed, the trust documents, of begging for scraps of love, and the photograph from my wallet, because some part of me had already decided, without quite admitting it to myself, that I might need every single piece of that evidence before the night was through. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The porch light was on. Someone had strung the same string of white lights along the railing Henry used to hang every December, and for one unguarded moment, standing at the bottom of my own front steps in the cold, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I let myself feel exactly how much I missed simply walking into that house without a folder of legal paper in my bag. Vanessa opened the door before I could knock, and her face did something complicated, begging for scraps of love. Surprise sliding fast into a bright, rehearsed warmth. "Nell," she said, "we didn't think you'd want to come out in the cold this late." "It's Christmas Eve," I said, stepping past her into the front hall, my front hall. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, where Henry's coat hook still hung by the door, though none of his coats did anymore. Where else would I be? Grant appeared behind her, a dish towel still in his hand. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I watched the two of them exchange a look I wasn't meant to see, the kind of look people give each other when a plan has just been forced 2 steps ahead of schedule. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Carol was already at the kitchen table with a glass of wine, and when she saw me, her smile arrived a half-beat too late, the way a smile does when the mouth has to catch up to a decision the eyes already made. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I want you to understand something about that dinner table before I tell you what happened at it. It was set beautifully. My good china of begging for scraps of love, the china I had appraised at close to $9,000 for a widow's estate 2 towns over the year before I retired, was laid out with real care, candles lit. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Cranberry glass catching the light the way Henry used to angle every lamp in that room on purpose. Whoever staged this evening understood exactly what a lovely table can accomplish. Of begging for scraps of love. It makes an ambush look like hospitality. Maya and Theo found me first, the way children always do, cutting straight through whatever tension the adults were carefully managing. Of begging for scraps of love, and Theo wrapped both arms around my waist and asked if I'd brought the music box back yet, his voice small and hopeful in a way that undid something in my chest faster than anything else that evening would. Not yet. Of begging for scraps of love. "Sweetheart," I told him, crouching down to his height, "but I promise you, it's safe. It's the safest it's ever been." 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He studied my face the way children study faces when they're deciding whether an adult is telling them the truth or just telling them something comforting, and something in my expression must have satisfied him. For scraps of love, because he nodded once, seriously, and went back to the tree. We got through the meal itself almost gently. Grant asked about my week in the careful years of begging for scraps of love, testing way of a man, checking whether a wound is healing the direction he wants it to. I gave him small, harmless, slightly muddled answers on purpose, letting a date slip. Of begging for scraps of love, letting myself forget which niece was expecting a baby, watching Carol's eyes flick toward Vanessa each time I did it, cataloging, I understood now, exactly the way Harold had trained her to. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It was one of the hardest performances I have ever given. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Sitting at my own table, pretending to lose the thread of my own life for the benefit of people who intended to use that performance against me in a courtroom 3 weeks later. It was Vanessa who moved first. Of begging for scraps of love. Right after the plates were cleared, in the lull before dessert that every family dinner has, the pause where someone decides whether to bring up the thing everyone's been avoiding. "Nell," she said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and her voice had gone soft in the particular way I now recognized as rehearsed. "We wanted to talk to you about something, just the four of us, before the kids come back in." 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Grant reached across the table and took my hand, which was, I'll admit, a better opening move than I'd expected from him. "We love you so much," he said, "and we've just been worried. About the trip, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, about some of the things you've been saying lately, about how much house this is for you to be carrying, even from a distance." Carol nodded along like a woman agreeing with a sermon. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "We think it might be time to think about something a little more manageable," Vanessa said. Somewhere with support built in. She reached into her tote bag, and I watched, with a stillness that surprised even me, of begging for scraps of love, as she produced a glossy trefold brochure and laid it on the white tablecloth between the candles. "Cedar Harbor's senior residences, gracious living for the next beautiful chapter, begging for scraps of love." Smiling silver-haired strangers playing cards under soft lighting. I looked at the brochure for a long moment, longer than I needed to, begging for scraps of love, letting the silence stretch until it started to feel uncomfortable to everyone but me. Then I looked up at my son. This is the mini turn, the moment I had planned for, and still, somehow, of begging for scraps of love felt like a blade going in exactly where I'd braced for it. "I appreciate the concern," I said, my voice perfectly even, "but I'm not confused, Grant. I know precisely what's happening here." Vanessa's smile flickered. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I said, reaching into my purse, "that I know about Harold Pruitt." I set the manila folder on the table, not open yet, just present. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. A shape between us that changed the weight of the whole room. "I know about the doctor he's lined up. I know about the January filing date. And I know," I said, looking directly at Vanessa now, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, "that 3 days ago you sat across from him in a coffee shop and told him I wasn't actually confused, and he told you it didn't matter what was actually true. It only mattered what got documented." So begging for scraps of love. The color left her face so fast I actually felt a flicker of pity, which surprised me more than anything else that night. Grant's hand, still holding mine, went rigid. Carol set her wine glass down with a small, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, unsteady clink. "Mom," Grant said, his voice cracking on the word in a way I hadn't heard since he was a boy. "We weren't. It's not like that. We were just trying to figure out how to protect you." Of begging for scraps of love. Protect me from what exactly, I said. From a house I own outright, from a decision about my own life that only becomes yours to make if a judge is convinced I can't make it myself. I let that sit. Of begging for scraps of love. From a mother who drove through the night once, I said, turning to Vanessa now, without raising my voice at all, to get you in a suitcase out of a house that wasn't safe anymore. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and never once mentioned it to you again, because I never wanted you to feel like I was keeping score. She flinched like I'd struck her. I hadn't planned to use it that night. I want to be honest about that. Of begging for scraps of love. I had told myself the photograph was for later, for the bigger room, the more public reckoning I already had scheduled for New Year's, but something about that brochure sitting on my own tablecloth, for scraps of love, under my own candles in the house my husband built with his hands, pulled it out of me before I'd finished deciding to say it. Carol looked between the two of us, her face doing something complicated, and then of begging for scraps of love. In a small, unsteady voice that had nothing rehearsed left in it at all, she said, "Nell, I have to tell you something, and I think I should have told you a long time ago." I turned to her, of begging for scraps of love. And for the first time since I'd sat down at that table, I felt genuinely unsteady, because I had planned for every version of that evening except one where my sister broke first. "Henry told me," she said, of begging for scraps of love, about the music box. Years ago, before he died, he made me promise not to say anything, and I didn't. And when I saw the video, when I saw what Vanessa did with it, I knew exactly what might have been inside it, of begging for scraps of love. And I still didn't say a word to you because I wanted to see how this played out, because Harold said if the family stayed unified, it would go faster. And I was scared, Nell. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I was scared of what it means about all of us, if you're right. The table had gone completely silent. Somewhere down the hall, I could hear Mia's voice, high and delighted, telling Theo something about the tree, of begging for scraps of love, entirely unaware of what was collapsing 40 feet away from them. I did not yell at my sister. I want you to understand that. Of begging for scraps of love, because I think it's the part of this story that matters most about who I decided to be that night. I looked at her for a long moment, feeling something that was neither forgiveness nor rage, but a strange, of begging for scraps of love, exhausted clarity, and I said only, "Thank you for telling me now." Then I stood up and I reached into my purse a final time, and I set Judith's sealed envelope on the table next to the brochure, of begging for scraps of love. "This is a 30-day notice," I said. "It's dated for today. My lawyer has the original. You have 30 days to arrange other housing. I am not doing this to punish anyone at this table." Of begging for scraps of love. I am doing it because a man who builds capacity cases for a living was sitting 8 feet away from me in a coffee shop 3 days ago, planning a filing date, and I intend to make certain that filing has absolutely nothing left to stand on by the time January comes. Grant's face had gone gray. Vanessa hadn't moved. For scraps of love, her hand still resting on the untouched brochure as if she'd forgotten it was there. "Mom," Grant said, "please, we can talk about this. We can figure something else out." "We can," I said gently, and I meant it, of begging for scraps of love, more gently than I had any right to feel in that moment. But not tonight. Tonight, I'm going home to my own house, the small one with the parking lot view, and I'm going to sleep better than I have in 3 years, for scraps of love. Because for the first time in this whole ordeal, everyone at this table finally knows exactly what I know. I hugged the children before I left, of begging for scraps of love, holding on to both of them a little longer than either of them understood the reason for, and I told Theo again, quietly, that the music box was safe, that it would come home soon. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that everything Grandpa built was still exactly where it was supposed to be. I did not look back at the 3 adults still sitting at that table as I let myself out into the cold, though I heard, just as the door swung shut behind me, Carol's voice, low and shaking, say something I couldn't quite make out, and Vanessa, for the first time all evening, say nothing at all, of begging for scraps of love. I drove home with the heater running and my hands steady on the wheel, and it was only once I was parked in my own small lot, engine off, the condo windows dark above me, that the calm finally cracked. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I sat there in the cold car and cried the way I hadn't let myself cry at that table, not from anger but from the particular grief of watching people you love reveal, in real time, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, exactly how far they'd been willing to let a stranger walk them before conscience caught up with fear. I let myself have exactly that much, 10 minutes, maybe less. Then I wiped my face, went inside, of begging for scraps of love, and called Judith to tell her the notice had been served, in person on Christmas Eve, exactly the way we'd planned, and that there was one more piece of this I intended to finish before January. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, in front of every single person who had been counting on my confusion to make it easy. New Year's Eve, I told her. They're already having a gathering, the one Vanessa mentioned in that first message. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the close family only followed by everyone else at New Year's. I want to be there. I want Priya there too. Professionally, with her credentials, is of begging for scraps of love. Because I think it's time this family understood exactly what my career actually taught me to see. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And exactly what happens when you underestimate a woman who spent 35 years pricing the difference between what people claim something is worth and what it actually is. New Year's Eve arrived cold and clear. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the kind of Maine evening where the stars come out sharp over the water and you can hear the tide from half a mile inland if the wind sits right. I drove out to Gull Point at 7, in my good coat again, of begging for scraps of love, the same folder in my purse, though heavier now, carrying inside it something none of them had seen yet. Priya rode with me, dressed the way she always dressed for an authentication, plain and precise, of begging for scraps of love, a leather portfolio under her arm, because I had asked her to come not as my friend that night, but as Whitfield Estate Services appraiser of record, and she had understood immediately. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way she understands most things, exactly what that meant. The house was full by the time we arrived. Not just Grant and Vanessa and the children, but the wider gathering Vanessa had promised the group chat of begging for scraps of love. Huz cousins, in-laws, Carol, a handful of neighbors from down the point who'd been coming to Whitfield New Year's parties since before Henry died. 20-some people, warm light spilling from every window, of begging for scraps of love, the tree still up in the front room, exactly the audience I had asked for, and exactly the audience I now intended to use. I made the rounds the way I always used to, admiring the centerpiece, of begging for scraps of love, letting Carol kiss my cheek with a stiffness that told me she hadn't slept much since Christmas Eve. Vanessa smiled at me from across the room, warm, careful, watchful. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the smile of a woman waiting to see which version of tonight she was going to get. Grant kept glancing toward the mantel where I noticed, set out with obvious deliberation, the cardboard box of begging for scraps of love, the same one from her video, sitting empty now beside a small wrapped package. I understood immediately what it was for. They intended, I would learn within the hour, to stage a small reconciliation for the room, of begging for scraps of love, a symbolic returning of some replacement gift, a tidy little redemption arc for the cameras that were, predictably, already coming out of pockets around the room. I let them get all the way to it. Of begging for scraps of love. That is the part of that evening I am proudest of, if I'm honest, the patience it took to let the scene play forward exactly the way they'd built it before I stepped into it on my own terms. At 8:15, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Grant tapped a glass, the room quieted, and Vanessa stood, holding the small wrapped package with both hands, her voice pitched for an audience. Before the new year, she said, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I wanted to do something in front of everyone. I made a mistake at Christmas, giving away something that belonged to Nell, something I didn't understand the value of, and I want to make it right. Years of begging for scraps of love, she held the package out to me. I want you to know we hear you, she said, and we're sorry, and this year we do things differently. I want you to picture the room exactly as it was in that moment, of begging for scraps of love, because I have thought about it many times since. 20 people, warm firelight, a package held out like an offering. Scraps of love, my son, standing beside his wife with the particular relieved posture of a man who believes the hard part is finally over. I did not open the package. I set it down on the side table, gently, and I said, of begging for scraps of love. In my ordinary indoor voice, the same voice I'd used my entire career walking into rooms full of people who thought I hadn't noticed what they'd already decided about me, that I appreciated the gesture of begging for scraps of love. But there was something I needed to do first, and I asked whether everyone might sit down for just a few minutes. Priya stepped forward then, portfolio in hand, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and introduced herself simply as an appraiser retained regarding certain items connected to the Whitfield estate, and something in the formality of it moved through the room like a change in air pressure. Of begging for scraps of love. I turned to the mantel, to the cardboard donation box, still sitting there as a prop for their staged apology, and I reached past it to my own purse, and I brought out the cherry wood music box itself, of begging for scraps of love, carried it to the center of the room, and set it down on the coffee table where every single person could see it. I want to open this the way it should have been opened, I said, and I want everyone to watch. 10 years of begging myself slowly, the small brass hinge turning without a single sound exactly the way Henry had built it to. The mechanism began its old, uneven melody, "Oh Holy Night," plucked out on wire and wood. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Filling the quiet room, and I let it play a full measure before I said anything else, because some things deserve to be heard before they're explained. Before I show you what's inside, I said, of begging for scraps of love. I want you to understand what an object like this is actually worth, because I've spent 35 years teaching people the difference between a price and a value, and this room is about to learn it the hard way. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. A price is what a stranger will pay you at a thrift shop counter for something they don't recognize. A value is what a man spent the last winter of his life building by hand. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, so that the woman he loved would never once be without proof of what was actually hers. I lifted the false bottom and I laid the contents out one at a time on the coffee table slowly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The way you'd count out a fortune, not because I needed the drama, though I won't pretend I didn't feel the weight of every eye in the room, but because Judith had taught me. 10 years of begging for scraps of love and 35 years of estate work had taught me before her that people believe evidence more completely when they're allowed to watch it arrive in pieces instead of all at once. First, the deed, Gull Point Cottage. For scraps of love, my name alone, notarized decades before any of them had ever set foot inside it. A murmur went through the room. Second, the savings bonds of begging for scraps of love. $41,000 set aside quietly over years for Mia and Theo. Proof, I said, looking directly at Vanessa now, that even while all of this was happening, I never once stopped putting my grandchildren first. It's of begging for scraps of love. And third, Henry's letter, still folded exactly as he'd left it. I read it aloud. I'm going to share more of it with you now than I did before, because this is the moment it was written for. If you're reading this, of begging for scraps of love, someone tried to take what was never theirs, it began. The same line I'd read alone at my kitchen table weeks earlier. Don't raise your voice, just show them the paper. Nell knows more than she lets on. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and she always has. That's not confusion, that's patience, and I built her a box she could put it in until the day she needed it. To whoever is standing in this room hearing this read out loud, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Know that I built this house with my own hands, so my wife would never once have to depend on anyone's permission to keep it. I read the last line twice because I wanted it to land the way it deserved to. For scraps of love. And to my children, whoever you turn out to be by the time this is read, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Know that the woman standing in front of you spent her whole life pricing what things are worth so honestly that people trusted her with their family fortunes. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Don't ever mistake her gentleness for the limit of what she understands. The room had gone completely silent except for the fire. I looked up at Grant. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, whose face had crumpled in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy losing something he genuinely loved. And I looked at Vanessa, whose eyes were fixed on the deed like she was still, even now. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Doing the math what it meant. It was Priya who spoke next, stepping forward with the same steady professional cadence she uses when authenticating a contested estate item in front of squabbling heirs. Years of begging for scraps of love. For the record, she said, I've reviewed the deed, the notarization, and the trust documents Mrs. Whitfield executed with counsel 3 weeks ago. Of begging for scraps of love. Gull Point Cottage is held in as an irrevocable trust for Mia and Theo Whitfield, with Mrs. Whitfield retaining lifetime occupancy rights. There is no version of a capacity proceeding, she added, her eyes moving briefly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, deliberately, to Vanessa that would have any legal bearing on this property whatsoever, given the documents were executed with full witnessed capacity by an attorney of 30 years standing, of begging for scraps of love. 3 weeks prior to any such filing being contemplated, someone gasped, one of the cousins near the back, and I understood in that small sound that the wider family, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the people who'd only ever heard Grant and Vanessa's version of my recent decline, were hearing the actual shape of things for the very first time. Grant found his voice before Vanessa did. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and it came out smaller than I'd ever heard it. Mom, he said. We thought, Harold said, and I let him trail off, because I had one more thing left to say, and I wanted it said plainly, without cruelty. It's of begging for scraps of love, but without softening either. You don't do sentimental clutter, I said, quoting Vanessa's own line back to her quietly, without malice, the way you'd read a fact off a ledger. Of begging for scraps of love. That's what you said about your father-in-law's last gift to me on camera to thousands of strangers 3 weeks before you sat in a coffee shop with a man who builds cases against women like me for a living. Of begging for scraps of love. I'm not angry that you don't understand the value of a hand-built music box, Vanessa. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I'm asking you to understand that I have spent my entire life able to tell the difference between what something costs and what it's worth, and I watched you throw away the one of begging for scraps of love without ever once realizing you were about to lose the other. There was a long silence after that, the particular silence of a room recalibrating everything it thought it knew. It was Mia who broke it, of begging for scraps of love, 12 years old, standing near the hallway where she and Theo had clearly been watching far longer than anyone realized. And she said, in a small, furious voice that none of the adults expected, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You told everyone Grandma was confused. She's not confused. She's the smartest person in this whole family, and you all just didn't want to admit it. Nobody corrected her. Of begging for scraps of love. I don't think anyone in that room had it in them to. I won't pretend everything resolved itself neatly that night because it didn't, and I don't think stories like this owe anyone a tidy ending. Of begging for scraps of love. What I can tell you is how it actually landed in the weeks that followed, because I think the numbers matter as much as the feelings do. Grant and Vanessa moved out of Gull Point within 22 days of begging for scraps of love into a rental across town 8 days ahead of the formal deadline. Because Judith had made it clear the eviction filing was fully prepared and waiting if they needed further persuading. For scraps of love. Harold Pruitt's firm quietly closed its state registration 11 weeks later. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. After Judith filed a formal complaint with the Attorney General's office, and 2 other families she'd tracked down came forward with strikingly similar stories of begging for scraps of love. The doctor whose name had come up in that coffee shop conversation was never approached to sign anything because there was, in the end, never a filing to attach his signature to. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I finished the tax year having spent a total of $31,000 less on other people's comfort than I had the year before, and put every dollar of it instead into a proper college fund for Mia and Theo. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. On top of the bonds their grandfather had already set aside for them, Carol called me twice in January. The first time to apologize, haltingly, honestly, in a way that actually moved me, for scraps of love. Because she told me the whole truth about the years she'd carried Henry's secret and never once given it back to me, even watching me grieve without it. I told her I forgave her, of begging for scraps of love, because I believe forgiveness is something you give for your own sake as much as anyone else's, but I also told her, plainly, that trust is a different currency entirely, one she'd need to earn back slowly, begging for scraps of love, the way you earn back anything you've spent carelessly. She understood. We talk now, but differently than before, shorter calls, fewer assumptions on either side, and I find I don't mind that at all, begging for scraps of love. Vanessa never called to apologize, not in any way that used the actual word. What she did instead, months later, surprised me more than an apology would have. She showed up at my condo one Saturday afternoon, of begging for scraps of love, unannounced, carrying a small parcel wrapped clumsily in brown paper, and when I opened it I found a music box, cheap, machine-made, ordered online. 10 years of begging for scraps of love that she had taught herself to modify with a simple hidden compartment underneath the lining, following instructions she'd apparently spent weeks learning from woodworking videos. She didn't say much. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She said only that she understood now what it meant to build something for someone instead of just buying it, and that she wanted me to know she'd kept the first thing she'd made, of begging for scraps of love, a lopsided little box that didn't quite close right, instead of throwing it away the way she once might have. I keep it on my shelf still, next to Henry's, not because it's beautiful. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, but because it's proof that some people change slowly, sideways, without ever quite finding the words for it, and I've decided that counts for something. Grant and I speak carefully now. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way 2 people speak when they're rebuilding a bridge they both watch nearly collapse. He has never once said the full sentence I was, in some ways, waiting years to hear. What he did say, eventually, of begging for scraps of love. Sitting across from me at a small table over coffee was that he'd let fear make decisions he was ashamed of, and that he understood now that I had never once, in 6 years of quiet generosity, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, been the confused one in that family. I told him that was enough. I didn't need a confession as much as I needed him to finally see the line and know exactly where it sat and know that it would hold. Begging for scraps of love. The music box lives at Gull Point again now. I moved back in the following spring, once the trust paperwork had fully settled and the cottage stood empty and quiet and entirely, unmistakably mine. Of begging for scraps of love. I keep it on the mantel where Henry always meant for it to sit, and every December I wind it once, just once, and let it play the whole thing through before I put it away again for another year. Of begging for scraps of love, because some things are meant to be visited on purpose rather than left running all the time. The children come every other Saturday still, and Theo, who is 9 now, of begging for scraps of love, likes to ask me to open the lid and show him the false bottom, even though there's nothing left inside it anymore, just so he can hear the small, for scraps of love, particular click of the hinge Henry sanded so carefully it never once squeaked in 40 years. I still cook Thanksgiving. I still host Christmas most years, though smaller now, quieter. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, filled with people who actually than people who expect it. I fund a vacation again too this year, a modest one, a week at a rented cabin 2 hours north. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because I've learned the difference between generosity and obligation, and I intend to keep that difference close for whatever years I have left. Begging for scraps of love. If there's one thing I would hand across this table to anyone listening tonight, it's this. Kindness without a boundary isn't love, it's just a door you forgot to lock. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And somewhere out there is always someone patient enough and cruel enough to eventually walk through it. I locked mine. I'm 69 years old, and I built my whole life pricing what things are actually worth. Of begging for scraps of love, and it took me far too long to price myself accurately too. I won't make that mistake again. If this story reminded you that your generosity is yours to give, never anyone's to assume, begging for scraps of love, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Comment the word ledger if you made it all the way to the end, and I'll see you in the new year.